public speaker and the founder of Monetary Metals. He will be talking about the dollar, cancer, and the gold cure. Oh, we're live. All right, well, sorry. YouTube people, you missed most of my intro, which was absolute gold. So please join me in welcoming Keith Weiner.
Thank you, Leslie. It's interesting that the word gold and the gold standard still permeates our culture. If you say that a talk was good, you say it was gold. All these years after, gold has been dismissed as a barbarous relic. So as Leslie said, I'm Keith Weiner. I'm founder and CEO of Monetary Metals. I'm an economist. And today I want to talk about the dollar cancer and the gold cure. The typical talk of this type, not by me, but I think typically out there, is kind of focused on quantity of dollars or quantity of pound sterling, and what supposedly happens is that they print, and then what's the supposed consequence of that is prices go up. And as many articles that I've read about this says, well, that's pretty much all you need to know about it. The end. You know, they print and prices go up. And I beg to differ with that view. I think there's a lot to know about this. I will try not to assume too deep a knowledge of economics, but there are a few concepts that I need to get into that are a little bit abstract. So I use the term cancer for a very specific reason. I mean, if all we had, let's say that problem was that simple, they print and that causes prices to go up. You know, we've had that for 100 plus years. That could go on for another 100 plus years or 1,000 plus years. They keep increasing the quantity and prices keep going up. And you know what? Most people, that wouldn't really, I mean, as long as they don't do it too rapidly, that wouldn't really affect most people's lives. Most people would, well, you get a raise every once in a while. If you're retired, you get a cost of living adjustment, we call it COLA in the US. There must be a similar term here in Britain. Most people wouldn't really care that much. So if you want to sell the idea of honest money, selling people that it's going to eliminate inflation is actually a pretty weak value proposition. You know, people that are on welfare, all they really care about is that their welfare program still pays enough for food and rent. Wage earners just care that their wages go up to pace inflation. If they don't get mad at the central bank typically, they get mad at their employer for being greedy and, you know, rapacious corporations that exploit the worker and that whole thing. You know, savers, investors just say, well, cash is trash. You have to buy some other asset that's going up at least as fast as inflation. Our environment certainly gives us multiple asset classes that go up much faster than consumer prices at the moment. There isn't really any major constituency that cares that much about rising prices as such, although economists focus on that a lot, maybe too much. So anyways, this talk is not going to be about they print and prices go up the end. This talk is going to be about something else. So what is a cancer? You think something, you know, the human body, let's say you have the thyroid gland, you know, in the neck. You need your thyroid. Without your thyroid, you don't produce the hormone, the thyroid hormone, and life depends on that. But if you get a cancer of the thyroid gland, then the thyroid gland begins to grow out of control. It becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, and if it's untreated, it will consume the body ultimately and choke the life out of you, perhaps literally if it's on your throat, and then you know, make life impossible. And so in the financial system, there's an equivalent organ, which is debt. Debt is absolutely necessary. I think it was the most important thing to focus on. The ability to lend and borrow was, I think, maybe not the only, but a necessary force that got the world out of the Dark Ages that after the fall of Rome. As it began to be possible, at first it was lending at interest was, of course, outlawed as usury. This is one of those areas, by the way, where the good guys in philosophy, Aristotle and Aquinas, were actually not the good guys of monetary theory, and they were against allowing lending at interest. But of course, nobody will lend unless they get interest, or unless they're in an irredeemable currency system. We'll talk about that in a bit. So at a certain point, they'd come up with some innovations, some clever legal workarounds, and eventually the religious strictures against lending had maybe not formally been renounced, but began to subside. You begin to have lending. So what does lending do? Lending is a win-win deal where you have one person who has money, so he has capital, but not income. Typically older, perhaps retired, perhaps not. But what he wants is income, and what he's got is a pile of asset of some sort. Let's say it's gold. In those days, it would have been maybe silver, maybe gold. On the other hand, you have somebody else who's an entrepreneur. The entrepreneur says, I'm full of energy. I have an idea to increase the production of an existing good, or I have an idea to create and produce a new good that doesn't exist in the world today. But I don't have any capital. I have income. I have the energy to work. I don't have any capital. I can't go forward. So in the world before lending and borrowing, this person would have to become an apprentice and a journeyman and then eventually master his craft. And by the time he would save up enough capital to implement his idea, he's reaching the end of his career. He no longer has the energy. And so you get a stagnation without lending. So eventually lending becomes a thing. Entrepreneurs can then make the world a better place, start to create all the goods and services that we take for granted today. On the other side, the person who's earning wages can set them aside, start earning interest from the moment he's working, compound that interest over the entire career, and then have a significant nest egg. So when I was starting my career, the standard advice was set aside 10% of your salary, put that in something really safe like a bank CD. 10%, by the time you get to 65, you will have, and the math worked out, whatever, $1.5 million, most of which, 85% of which, as I recall, was the compounding of the interest. Only like 15% was the actual set aside of your wage. And then if you don't have interest, you know, compounding, this doesn't work, so you can't really attain your goals without interest, which is perhaps one reason why young people today feel that the system is rigged and it's unfair, and all this stuff comes up without inequality. And as an aside, I think it's the wrong answer to say, well, in a free market, of course there's inequality. Yes, that's true, but there's some very non-free market forces that are pushing people down, and the inability to earn interest means that, you know, people that are starting their careers don't have a means to really, you know, the treadmill is cranking faster and faster. They don't have a means to catch up because we've deprived them of interest today. That's our world, allegedly to stimulate and bail out and all the alleged reasons for it, but that's the reality of it. So, but anyways, when you have interest, the wage earner can save for retirement, and when he gets to retirement, then he can, begin to live on the interest and not consuming the capital. We live in a world today where people think about what is the purchasing power, and I don't know that people would say this explicitly, but I think they think of their entire portfolio as essentially what's the liquidation value. I bought this asset, now I can sell it, and how much groceries, how many years worth of my cost of living can I pay out of the proceeds of the sale of a capital asset? So imagine you inherit the family farm. There's two things you can do with it. You can either walk all the grounds and look at it and say, I can increase milk production with the cows by doing this. I can increase the meat production of the pigs by doing this. Here's the cornfield, here's the orchard, here's all the things I can do to optimize the amount of food that I can grow on my farm. Or, especially in a world where maybe crop yields are failing, but, and as an analogy for money yields, which today are failing, but the prices of all the pieces of the farm are going off. So you sell off the back 40 to a condominium developer. And the condominium developer says, you know, you've got all those apple trees over there. It's really cool to make cabinets out of apple wood. So you chop down the orchard and you sell off the wood. Then he says, you have those barns. Why don't you tear those down, because old barn planks make really cool floors. And then you don't need that tractor anymore. And we have an artist over here who's going to discombobulate the tractor and then polish it up and turn it into an object of art to stick in the atrium of our brand new condominium tower. And so what you're doing is, instead of operating the farm to grow food, you're selling off bits of the farm to buy groceries. So there's a perverse process here of consuming capital. Anyways, I get ahead of myself. So we have this cancer today, and that is the debt is growing and growing exponentially. And why is that so? So there's two fundamental flaws in the dollar system, in my view. I know one of them is not, they print too much and prices rise. So the first one is there's no extinguisher of debt in the system. Now what do I mean by that? Suppose I borrow $100 from Razi, or he pays my way. We go to a fancy restaurant. I say, oh, I lost my credit card. So he pays. I owe him $100, or £100 in this case. I come back the next day and I take out some pieces of paper I don't know what the British money says. In the US it says note on it. The dollar bill, bill is a word for credit. Actually it doesn't say the word bill on it, it says the word note. Note is another word for credit. I give him a credit slip and say, we're all good, right? And he says, yeah, that's fine, that's the money. What is it? I've now given him someone else's credit, so I'm out of the debt loop. The debt actually hasn't been extinguished, it's just merely been shifted. So if this were the US, that would be the the Federal Reserve owes him the money. In this case, it would be the Bank of England. So what is he going to do? He's going to go to the bank and deposit it. Now the bank owes him, and the Bank of England owes that bank. And then what is that bank going to do? Well, they're going to buy gilts, because that's what banks are supposed to do. And so now Her Majesty's government owes the bank, and you see all what we're doing is we're shifting the lump under the rug this way and that, but we're not actually making the debt go away. We just shift it around, which means that the debt must grow every year by at least the amount of accrued interest. That is, somewhere along the line this thing has been borrowed into existence, and let's say it's 3%, so there's $103 at the end of the year. The debt must be at least 103, and it's actually a lot more than that, because what they have to do is prevent the marginal debtor from defaulting, which wouldn't be the government, it would be perhaps the restaurant out there or whoever. You don't want that default of the marginal debtors, because that will begin to cascade, that will wipe out their creditors, who then become the next marginal debtors, and the dominoes begin to fall, which is what had begun to happen in the late 90s, and then certainly in 2008. That probably would have happened in 2020. So they have to keep lowering the interest rate and do all these things to fix this. Or I should say, kick the can down the road is not a fix, excuse me. So the debt cannot be paid, it can simply be serviced, which means every debtor is always trying to produce whatever it is that debtor produces. It could be labor if you're an individual, it could be corn if you're a farmer, it could be cars if you're Ford Motor Company. They must produce enough so that they can at least pay the interest expense on their debt. What happens if you don't pay the interest expense? Well, the bank comes along and repossesses what now becomes their property, and you lose your collateral, which is your business, your house, etc. So the debt must be serviced. The debt is growing, and it's growing exponentially. And that trend has been true. People say, almost as if they discovered this as a shock, X% of all the dollars in existence, occurred during the last 3 years. That's always been true, or at least going back to 1971. That's what exponential means, is about every 8 years, we're doubling the total quantity of debt in the system. Necessarily so. To borrow from Dr. Leonard Peikoff, when he talks about inductive logic, he says that it's logic. The conclusion necessarily follows. It's not, well, maybe, it's not, well, probably. We've seen a few examples, but who knows. Necessarily so, the debt grows exponentially. So, unlike rising prices, which is a linear trend, and prices have been rising for 100 years, and maybe they'll rise for another 100 years or another 1,000 years, what happens to the end of every exponential trend? So in the United States, in the 1970s, the radical tree huggers, or in this case Bambi huggers, somewhere in New England, I don't remember where, said, okay, we're not going to allow hunting of deer anymore. And so the deer population now began to multiply and get out of control, because of course by then all the natural predators were long gone. You don't have wolf populations, wolf packs roaming around in New England anymore, it's all settled. So the deer population begins to explode. It's an exponential trend. And when it gets to the end of it, it collapses. There's not a graceful subsiding, it is an absolute collapse. Another exponential trend would be if you're playing electric guitar, Jimi Hendrix is very famous for this, and then you turn to the amplifier and hold the guitar where the strings are 2 inches away from the speaker. So what happens is the speaker is then putting all that sound energy into the speaker, into the strings vibrate more, that goes electronically into the amplifier, which generates more signal, which then makes the speakers vibrate louder, which makes the strings vibrate louder. That's a positive feedback loop, that's an exponential trend, and then you hear that squeal. If they didn't have a special circuit in the amplifier to stop this, then the way it would end would be the house would burn down. Exponential trends do not end gracefully. Another exponential process is a thermonuclear bomb. When you drop the atom bomb, you put all the U-235 or plutonium, was it 240? I don't remember the has of the right weapons-grade plutonium anymore. You get critical mass. This one, fissions, sends out some neutrons, which causes this one to fission, or two more to fission, and then the thing grows exponentially. The end result is mass destruction. That is what we have in our system. Exponential positive feedback loop, exponential trend of debt growth. That is where we're headed. So just like a cancer, if you have a cancer in your throat, it is growing out of control until it will kill you. That is the fundamental problem that we're facing today. I said there are two fatal flaws in the dollar system. The other one being the interest rate is unstable and unhinged. So what do I mean by that? If you had an honest monetary system, let's say gold, the person who is the lender, which ultimately boils down to individuals, you could say, well, banks lend, that's true, but banks can only lend whatever capital that the depositors give to the banks to lend. So individuals ultimately making a decision, will I lend or not? Now, I used to give this a little bit as a pure abstract theory, and my company has now actually proven it. So we're in the position to conduct experiments in monetary science in an actual marketplace today. And that is, if the interest rate is zero, how much gold are people going to put to lend? Any guesses? Zero. Nobody lends at zero, if they have a choice. So when the governments of the world moved off the gold standard, people say that's so they can print and debase the money. The fundamental issue here is they can manipulate the interest rate, and so they can borrow more cheaply, and therefore spend more, and spending is a process of buying votes, right? So they can buy more votes by borrowing more, and now people are disenfranchised. The whole point of making the currency irredeemable, you no longer have a choice. You can say, well, I'm going to take my money, which is really credit, out of the bank, and you get these paper notes. Those paper notes are still a credit instrument. And now you're simply you're lending to the Fed, or you're lending to the Bank of England, rather than lending to someone else. But that party, the Fed or the Bank of England, is lending to the banking system, and through the banking system to everyone else. So they've taken away the choice of the saver, and that's why the interest rate could be zero, even negative. You have negative interest rates here in Britain on short-dated bonds. In Switzerland, it's negative interest rates all the way throughout the entire yield curve. Their currency, in my opinion, is done as a result of that. Think of not the hyperinflation, the hot flash. Think of the cold death of drowning as the entire yield curve from overnight to 30 years subsides under the cold water and into the darkness, never to be seen again. So the interest rate can go all the way to the moon, as it did after World War II through 1981. The interest rate skyrockets, and that causes a whole heap of problems, which is a whole set of lectures. Or the interest rate can fall into the black hole of zero, and then apparently when you get into the black hole of zero, to continue the physics analogy, there's a wormhole in there, and when you go through the wormhole on the other side, you're in a negative universe where interest rates can go negative. This is not abstract theory. This is, in fact, we have negative interest rates in Switzerland, Scandinavia, Germany, a couple other European countries, the UK on the short end of the curve, Japan, and other countries have negative interest rates. You lend the government 1,000 of whatever the currency unit is, and they pay you back $950 in 10 years. I mean, what a great deal, right? So, as former President Trump said, hey, give me some of that cheap money. Everybody wants to borrow, but the saver doesn't have a choice about lending. But anyways, getting back to an honest monetary system where you cannot presume for the saver and just take, I'll help myself to your capital. You actually have to offer something to the saver that respects the saver's prerogative to say no. The saver will not lend for zero. There's some threshold, which I think the proper term for that is marginal time preference, or the time preference of the marginal saver. Mises calls this originary interest. Is getting at the concept from a different angle. There's some threshold below which it ain't worth it. You just say, no, thanks bro, I'm all good. I'll just keep my gold. But if I get over that threshold, whatever that might be for me personally, but as an economy marginal time preference, the gold comes into the banking system, and so you have a floor under the rate of interest in a free market, in a gold standard. There's absolutely a floor because nobody will lend below that floor, or not enough to drive the economy. There's also a ceiling above that, which is the marginal return on capital, or the marginal productivity of the entrepreneur. If I run a hamburger business and I'm getting 8% return on capital, I absolutely cannot borrow at 10%. If the interest rate is 10%, I should sell all my capital assets, not only pay off my debt, but whatever's left over, I should actually invest it in the bonds. Someone else is getting a much higher return on capital than I am. I'm better off. Right? And Atlas Shrugged, which character was it that was looking forward to Ellis Wyatt coming to be the oil man? Because he said, I'll be better working for him than for, or was it Dagny and somebody was trying to do a railroad? Anyway, there was a second-rate entrepreneur who said, no, it must have been Wyatt, because he was explaining this to Dagny, and Dagny was like, wait, you'd rather work for this other person than have your own business? He said, yeah, because productivity is so much higher. If you're only getting 8% and the market's getting 10, you have a hell of a lot less work, not to mention risk and headaches, to simply liquidate everything and put it into somebody else's bond. So that's the ceiling over the rate of interest in a free market, is marginal return on capital. And if you look out there and you see hamburger restaurants and you see companies that build container ships and you see companies that are manufacturing suits of clothing or whatever, or chairs for amphitheaters, there is going to be a pretty consistent return on capital, maybe adjusted for how proprietary it is. Apple certainly gets a much higher return on capital than others, because they have a defensible moat around their business. But for the most part, the people who make window panes, the people who make microphones and video camera lenses and all these things, there's a return on capital that's pretty even. And the interest rate can't go above that. So you have a floor, you have a ceiling, and the interest rate can jitter around between those two. Those two tend to be fairly tight. And so during the gold standard, the interest rate is pretty stable. That's not what we have today. Because the saver has been disenfranchised, we have this system that has eliminated the negative feedbacks that I just described and replaced it with positive feedbacks instead. So we had a runaway interest rate up to 1981, where it spiked to ridiculous heights. And then we have a falling interest rate now that just apparently doesn't seem to have a floor. It can go negative. And if it can go to -1, why couldn't it go to -2? If it can go to -2, why couldn't it go to -3? There's apparently no limit. Well, except there are some limits. Why don't we, somebody has a question here for the benefit of the live stream, hold the questions to the end, and then let me sort of get through this and then deal with it then. So there are some problems with negative interest rates. It should be obvious if I'm an entrepreneur and I think I'm clever, however, the numbers don't lie, my business is destroying my investors' capital at a rate of -1% per year. Hypothetically, it's not my business. My business should be closed, and that capital and the employees should shift over to other businesses that are doing a better job of it than I am. But however, what if I was in a bizarro world on the other side of a wormhole and I could borrow at -2%? So my investors expect their capital to be destroyed at -2%. I'm only merely destroying it at -1%. I get to write a +1% profit. Hey, that's pretty good. So I'm rewarded with a profit, rewarded with the ability to continue on doing this, and actually I should probably scale up my business. I should grow and do more of this wealth destruction thing. Wasn't that a problem for society? If wealth destroying enterprises are profitable, is there not a finite terminus to that? And that is when we run out of capital that can be consumed, or in Ayn Rand's expression, we eat all the seed corn, and eventually the bin comes up empty. Then things get a whole lot more serious at that point. So we have this, and there's a lot of other reasons why negative interest rates are enormously destructive, but just leave that with that one. Now let's look at the process of falling. So that's when the interest rate is too low and below 0, as a separate and distinct phenomena of falling interest rate. So every day the market opens, there's an interest rate that can essentially making an offer to every entrepreneur, every enterprise in the economy. So let's say, sir, you run a hamburger restaurant, you run a pizza restaurant, you have a car factory, you make lenses for video cameras, you make glass panes for buildings like this, and so forth, you grow corn. everybody's looking at that interest rate, and everybody has their contingent business plans. Could I borrow to expand production? And everybody, the marginal entrepreneur is the one who stopped, who said, I can't borrow right now to expand production because it doesn't make any business sense. My spreadsheet, at the very bottom line, there's a red number. But then the Federal Reserve lowers the interest rate. Ding! One day you wake up, you see an interest rate, you plug it in, and now your formula turns green. It makes sense. So every time the interest rate falls, it is an increased incentive to borrow versus what it was yesterday. So yesterday you didn't take it, today it's gone down, and the marginal entrepreneur is the one who takes it and borrows and goes deeper into debt, which we already explained can't be paid, or it can't be paid off anyway. So every time the interest rate falls, there's an additional incentive to borrow more, and the interest rate has been falling for 40 years, probably longer than most of the people in this room, with one or two exceptions, have been walking this earth. The interest rate has been in a falling trend, which means every day there's been jitters, I exaggerate slightly, paint with a broad brush slightly to make a point, but every day there's been an increased incentive compared to yesterday to borrow. If you didn't want to borrow yesterday, you borrow today as the interest rate falls. So everybody loads up on debt, and what we get is essentially a subsidy. We're feeding the capital of the saver to the entrepreneur as a subsidy to increase production, which means we end up with surpluses. I was talking to somebody earlier today about the gold refining business. In his estimate, there's at least double to triple the amount of gold refining capacity in the world relative to the amount of gold that needs refining. So you end up with this surplus. Let's say you run a hamburger restaurant, you have 174 stores located around the UK. The interest rate goes down, you borrow and open up the 175th store. And you have 10 competitors who all do the same thing. Unless the appetite for hamburgers increases, which, since we're just talking about a monetary change, that's not the case, then every one of those all hamburger stores, the old ones and the new ones, the same amount of business has to be spread across more hamburger stands. So what happens is the overall rate of return in the entire economy is being pulled down through an arbitrage process to the interest rate, which is unhinged, and therefore it's like the entire economy, tied this giant anchor, which was thrown overboard, and the anchor is pulling all the people off the ship who have the thing tied around their neck, pulling them all down, and one by one, they're all splashing into the water. So this is the cancerous process, and I just want to see did I paint a clear picture of kind of what's going on here? That we have this growth of this debt. First of all, it's necessary as a function of the debt can't be extinguished, and therefore it has to grow. But also, with the falling interest rate, there's a fresh new incentive to add to the debt. And every participant in the economy has that incentive. So what happens is, all the things that had such a compelling business case where they could borrow at 10%, they've already borrowed, they've already gone into debt. Then at 9, the next person, next person, next person. This is also a process of capital churn, which many people can mistake for Schumpeter's creative destruction. So if I borrow at 10% and I open a hamburger restaurant, and then they cut the interest rate to 8% and Razi borrows, he can do one of two things. He can either borrow the same amount of money as I did and open up an identical store right next to me, only he has a lower monthly payment. He has a durable competitive advantage, doesn't he? And no matter how smart I am, I can't compute the fact that his monthly payment is a couple $1,000s lower than mine. Or he builds something that's more glorious and more opulent with higher end finishes. His place looks cool, and next to his, mine kind of looks a little old and dumpy. By comparison, he wins all the business. Now so what happens is he puts the squeeze on me. Maybe I don't got a business yet, but then the interest rate is lowered to 6%. I'm done. I can't compete with the guys that are borrowing at 6. Now, Razi, who'd been in a good position, is no longer in a good position. The squeeze is on him, and the guy who just borrowed at 6 is feeling good. And down and down and down the interest rate goes, and there's just this relentless churn, enabling essentially soft, if not falling prices, which is a whole other lecture as well. But anyways, the picture I'm trying to paint here is that there's destruction happening on multiple levels because of this unstable interest rate. And there is no force to stabilize it because the saver's preference has been taken out of the equation, and a whole bunch of other dynamics are occurring here. One other thing to be worth mentioning here is, everybody familiar with John Maynard Keynes? That's not an unfamiliar name. So John Maynard Keynes, in my opinion, was a genius, but evil. That is, he knew what he was doing, and his intention was to destroy. So he was the Ellsworth Toohey, or the Immanuel Kant of economics. It wasn't that he was accidentally wrong, it wasn't that he was stupid or incompetent. He knew what he was doing. So there's a famous quote that most people in the gold world would know, and perhaps in the crypto world as well, that may cite this, that there's no surer way of overthrowing capitalism, which means overthrowing civilization. Civilization depends on capitalism or some remnant of capitalism. If you completely destroy capitalism, obliterate it, what you have is a totalitarian dictatorship, which can't stand on its own. So the no surer process of overthrowing, I will substitute the word civilization as such, than by debauching money. And it goes on and on and on. And most people assume that what he's talking about, and then he says, you impoverish everybody, but arbitrarily enrich a few. And even their fellow bourgeois, which is contempt for the word bourgeois, like all socialists do, even their fellow bourgeois will resent those few who are getting arbitrarily rich. And anyways, he finishes the quote with, by leveraging all of the hidden forces of economics, which today the word for that would be incentives, by leveraging all the hidden forces of economics in favor of destruction, and not one in a million can diagnose what the heck is going on. Now, most people that I've spoken to and talked about on this topic assume that what Keynes meant was inflation. You debauch the money, which means you're printing more, which means diluting its purchasing power, and prices go up. Except we have this little weird thing where he says not one in a million can diagnose it. So he is either just foolishly wrong, like in a simple, obvious, like first year student level is stupid wrong, to think that nobody would notice inflation. Nobody could be able to diagnose what's happening when you have a rise in inflation. Or, that's one theory, or, and by the way, I was 12 years old in 1979, and I remember when inflation was rampant. Everybody talked about inflation every day. It wasn't like one in a million could figure it out and everyone else was clueless. Every night on the nightly news, they had something in New York called the Misery Index, which was like the average of inflation and unemployment, or maybe inflation plus unemployment. They talked about inflation every day on the daily news. Everybody talked about it at work. It was constantly everywhere. I don't think Keynes meant that people would be, the 999,999 out of a million people would be too blind or too dumb to see inflation. I think he meant something else. So elsewhere he talks about the euthanasia of the rentier, which means the saver who lives on interest. He calls the rentier a functionless parasite. And he's very explicit in what he wants to do as a general social cure, and of course also to destroy this parasite, which is lower the interest rate to 0. So this is what he's talking about with debauching the money, and the process of lowering the interest rate to 0. He was absolutely correct. Not one in a million can diagnose it today. And even when I write articles that I think explain it pretty clearly, I see from the questions, and in some cases the angry comments, people don't see it even when you explain it to them, what is going on with lowering the interest rate to 0. I will cut to the chase and hand the conclusion on a silver platter. The price of assets is basically the inverse of interest rates. And yes, there's discounting for risk, and there's a bunch of other factors, and obviously it depends on sentiment, but as the interest rate goes down, the price of capital assets goes up, and it's an inverse, which means every halving of the interest rate is a doubling of asset prices. So at 0, you have it's a meaningless, undefined, what does divide by 0 mean? At 0, in theory, the asset price could be infinity. So you have a process of asset prices going absolutely ballistic, which is of course exactly what we see in our world today, as interest rates are going to 0 today. Now, why can't people see what is wrong with this? And this is where I think he was absolutely brilliant. He's smarter than his followers. I've read what's considered to be the seminal work of Janet Yellen, who was a card-carrying member of the new Keynesian school. Keynes is absolutely smarter than these people. These people actually are pretty mediocre mentalities, second-rate intellectuals. And I think Keynes is smarter than most of his critics. Why can't people see how this is destroying the world? When it's right there for everybody to see in the markets. Why can't they see it? Anybody in the room have a guess? Because it's a bull market.
Yeah, I'm not too sure why that's happening, but yeah, one thing I got curious about, you know, you said about the black hole earlier. Is it scientifically possible for anyone to survive it, or would everyone die if they went through it? Do you think?
Well, I think everybody would die. This is just a loose metaphor. So nobody's diagnosing what's wrong because it's a bull market. I mean, who could disagree with it? Who could dislike a bull market? I mean, everybody wins in a bull market, right? Assets go up, everybody gets richer. Bull markets are wonderful fun. I've had so many arguments with objectivists that will say the fact the stock market's going up proves, well, they won't say it when Obama was president and the stock market was rising during Obama's 8 years, and they don't say it during Biden's presidency when the stock market's been rising. But when they have the guy of their more preferred team, let's call him Trump, but also Bush, objectivists will say his policies must be good for business, must be good for the economy. Proof is stocks are going up. So stocks are going up, not only people being enriched, but also it seems to prove the confirmation bias that they have that, you know, this is good for business, it must be good for the economy. And I'll just add one more thing. Upton Sinclair, who I'm not a fan of, he's the guy who was a muckraker writing about unsafe meat, and obviously alleging free markets lead to unsafe food. But Upton Sinclair has a quote, and it basically says, "It's impossible to teach a man something that his salary depends on him not knowing." I think, boy, is that apropos for trying to show why falling interest rates, which means rising asset prices, is destroying our world. You can't show people that are making money, or so they think, in this process, because it's wonderful fun, and besides, they're getting rich. So we have this situation. 1 in a million, can see it, perhaps. I think he might have actually underestimated how many people can see it. 999,999 can't see it, and even when you explain it to them, they're reluctant, or it takes them multiple readings, or whatever. Maybe they watch me on a YouTube video, and they've already read something like, this is starting to click. It's almost making some sense. But for the most part, it's a bull market. Bull markets are supposed to be a good thing. Who could be so dastardly? Who could be so socialist? People call me a leftist sometimes. How so? You're no friend of business. You're no friend of the economy. How could you be against a bull market? I mean, do not underestimate the amount of derision that would come to somebody as to suggest that perhaps a bull market is not necessarily a good thing. I want to hold comments and questions to the end, and then I'll engage as long as they'll keep the cameras rolling. So I've coined a term and proposed a concept in economics that I haven't seen anywhere else that I call yield purchasing power. So purchasing power is if I liquidate whatever, it could be a house, it could be Bitcoin, it could be gold, it could be just that my cash savings is held in cash. Purchasing power is how many groceries can I buy, or cars, or whatever consumer goods that you may prefer. How many groceries can I buy with this capital asset? And I think that is not the right way to look at things. I think that's unhealthy for a lot of reasons. As I said, wages would generally keep up if it was just simply an inflation thing. Now we're talking about capital, which is an entirely different thing. So yield purchasing power is not saying, what if I liquidate my farm, how many groceries could I buy? Yield purchasing power is saying, what's the yield of the farm? So and literally in the farm analogy, you're growing the food, so that's the end of the question, full stop. How much food can you grow on your 100-acre farm? But the concept of yield purchasing power is, if I have $1 million, let's say, how much groceries could I buy? Not by liquidating the $1 million, but by investing that $1 million in something reasonably simple and reasonably safe, like a 3-month bank CD, a 3-month deposit. How much groceries could I buy on that? And when you look at it that way, when you plot out the graph, what you see is that there's jitter in it, but it's a sideways trend up until the early 1980s. And then you begin to see what looks like a hyperinflation. So I wrote an article about comparing two hypothetical guys One guy retires in 1979 with $100,000. So picture a successful blue-collar worker, like a machine shop foreman, probably could have had, if he saved his money, $100,000 saved up by the time he turned 65 years old in 1979. And the prevailing rate on a 3-month CD in the US, he would be living the median lifestyle on the interest. And then as the interest rate begins to fall in the 1980s, you see this hyperinflation. And I think I wrote my article, I don't know, 5 years ago or something like that now. And by the time I wrote the article, it took over $110 million invested in a 3-month bank CD to earn enough income, enough interest income on the savings to live the median lifestyle. $110 million. Now, first of all, nobody has $110 million. Most wage earners don't. And anybody who has $110 million, they're not interested in living the median lifestyle. They want to be jetting around the world and driving Lamborghinis or maybe have a chauffeur-driven Rolls-Royce limousine or something like that. So something has gone absolutely wrong in the world, and compared to 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, suddenly there's this takeoff in how much capital you need to earn interest to pay the median lifestyle. So this is another way of looking at this destruction that's going on that is just getting ahead of us, and it's hidden and not 1 in a million can diagnose it. So we have the problem that the debt grows exponentially. We have the problem the interest rate is completely unhinged, and the unhingedness, especially on the falling direction, perversely incentivizes. So I don't like the term unintended consequences, because first of all, that's granting a benevolent intention to people that aren't necessarily benevolent when politicians pass some stupid law like rent control. Their intentions are not benevolent, and then, oh, well, they didn't intend to create a housing crisis. Well, maybe they intended it, maybe they didn't, but instead of putting the focus on their intentions, the concept of perverse incentive says, this is what they've done, and now the incentive on landlords and property developers has been changed. So in this case, we have a perverse incentive to borrow more, to buy assets which are going up, but not to save. Why bother saving at zero? And not only is the interest rate zero, but there's a relentless loss of purchasing power of your currency. So not only wouldn't you ever get ahead by saving at zero anyway, on top of it, it'd be kind of dumb because your entire life savings would be enough to buy a toothbrush by the time you turn 65. So perversely, people are not incentivized to save, which means real savings goes away, but that's capital accumulation, which is what makes civilization possible. And instead, you're perversely incentivized to borrow. And what is the best thing to borrow to buy in this environment is financial assets. Because financial assets are going up. Every halving of the interest rate is a doubling of financial assets. The smartest thing to do to play the game in this system is to borrow more, to buy more financial assets. Financial assets go up, and now you're truly making riches. And nobody asks the question, where does that riches come from? But leaving that aside. That is the perverse world we're in today. That is, to sum that up with a 2-word moniker to put on that, dollar cancer. Everything is going in the wrong direction. It's running out of control. It's a positive feedback loop, exponential thing. It's going to kill us. It's growing exponentially. I thought cancer would be the most apt analogy for that. Assuming that's clear, that's the first half of what I had to say. Second half is, okay, how the hell do you get out of this? This is a runaway machine. So picture, I don't know, there's so many analogies, but you have a train rolling down the tracks, the brakes are no longer working, the hill's getting steeper, and if it doesn't derail somewhere along the way, there's a sharp curve overlooking a cliff that the train is going to fall over, and we're on this runaway train. How do you stop it? Somebody on Twitter last week tweeted something that I just thought was very simple and very profound. He said, everybody's aware that there's a problem. I think he meant everybody's relatively sophisticated in what's called FinTwit, or the financial Twitter circles that exist on Twitter. Everybody's aware there's a problem, and nobody is trying to think about how to solve it. They're only thinking how to make enough money that they personally would be able to bypass the consequences. So my anecdote for that, I think it was at the British Museum. I saw an exhibit of gold hoards that were dug up dating to the fall of Rome, so 476 AD. And these hoards were buried for 1,500 years until property developers after World War II were digging for larger buildings and going to deeper basements, and then unearthed, and they called them the archaeologists. So every one of these hoards was at least a couple hundred ounces of gold, which is a fortune today, and it was a fortune back then, and some of them were thousands of ounces. So what happened? These were obviously very rich people. They owned a lot of gold, and somehow they lost their gold. So in the cataclysm, that must have been what it was like in 476 AD, I would imagine most of them got killed and the gold did not avail them. And those that didn't get killed had to flee, and maybe they had a farm somewhere in the south of France or something. They probably grabbed some gold, put it in their pocket, but you can't carry thousands of ounces and certainly can't get it out that quickly when barbarians are in with torches and swords and all that. So the gold was abandoned and lost. And so I think the moral of this story is, even if you have a lot of money, it may not avail you when this catastrophe comes. So how do you get out of this? A lot of people in the gold community would say the government is going to inflate their way out of this. All they have to do is gin up some inflation. If prices were to, let's say, double from here, then the value of the debt is effectively cut in half and everything's fine. And so we can essentially pay off the debt, not by amortizing it, by getting the tax revenues, but by devaluing it. And so if the dollar is worth half as much in purchasing power, then the debt is worth half as much. And we'll get out of it this way. Well, I would suggest for you that if you're in a hole, digging deeper can't possibly be the way to get out of the hole. So inflation is the process of borrowing more. And yes, it may be true that the value of each individual unit of dollar or pound is worth a bit less, but you owe exponentially more of them. You can't get out with this process. So you can't get out that way. A lot of people think, okay, I'll just buy whatever asset and I'll get out personally. But if the world comes to the cataclysm of something like the collapse of Rome, then that may not really value. So my appeal to the audience, both here live and on streaming and on YouTube, is everybody has a vested interest in how do we get out of this? Because if we don't get out of this, this is going to be really, 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 really bad. How do you get out of this? So I said that the twin problems that are driving this are no extinguisher of debt and unstable interest rate. And I also said that gold has this, forget gold, really, a free market has this characteristic that debt can be extinguished because we're not forced to use irredeemable government credits as if it were money. We pay something that extinguishes the debt. And I said that nobody, if they had a choice, nobody will lend unless they got an interest rate that satisfied time preference, which is definitely not zero. So we have to find a transition from this messed up world that's destroying itself to a gold standard. How do you do that? The standard answer in the gold community would be it's a function of price. They would say, well, there isn't enough gold at today's price. But if you divide whatever preferred measure of the money supply that you choose by the amount of gold ounces either that are known to be out there in the world or in the possession of the government or the Bank of England or whatever, then you say, well, this is what the gold price should be. And if the gold price would reach that, then somehow we get to nirvana. So my answer to that is no, that's not even wrong. It's not a matter of price. There is no price at which gold would circulate. And gold has to circulate by definition. People have to be first borrowing in a sound money to finance production. It's not a matter of, okay, you buy this asset, whether it's gold or silver or Bitcoin or whatever, and it goes up faster than inflation. But meanwhile, the entire world is producing the things we all need. Let's start with food. The farmer is borrowing dollars. So Bitcoin and gold don't solve the problem because he has to borrow dollars because that's the only thing available to borrow. And therefore, he has to service his debts. He has to dump enough corn on the bid price and to raise the dollars to service the debt, which is what gives strength to the purchasing power of the dollar in the first place. Every producer is struggling under the load of having to produce more and more and more, faster and faster and faster, in order to service their debts. Otherwise, they get repossessed. So how do you get to the point where, let's say gold, is financing productive things? Farmers borrow money to plant and put seeds in the ground and remove the weeds and spray down pesticide and spray down fertilizer, and then at the end they have to harvest it. And all the money has to be spent up front, and the revenues from the harvest have to come at the end. Classic case for borrowing. They have to borrow. Everything that we have, from phones to cars to, you name it, there was borrowing involved in the production of that thing. That's the problem we're trying to solve, is we're perversely incentivizing the producers to go deeper and deeper and deeper into hell and destruction, or falling deeper into the black hole where they can't survive. We're perversely incentivizing that. We have to segue to something where that's not the case anymore. It's not a matter of price. Gold could be $2,000 an ounce, it could be $20,000 an ounce, it could be $2 million an ounce, doesn't matter. It will never circulate. The people who own the gold will hold it until they're ready to sell, which is either because the price rose enough that now they don't want to own the gold anymore, or it falls enough, we hit their stop limit order and they sell it. And so the gold becomes, and the same thing is true in Bitcoin, it's a dry thing that doesn't circulate and isn't borrowed and lent, more importantly. So how do you we have this system that's destroying. It's not a matter of price. What is the mechanism? The mechanism is interest rate. If there's an interest rate to be had, the gold will come out and be offered into the market. Employers can then borrow it, pay their expenses, including wages. People have a gold income. They can spend their income. People do not want to spend their capital unless you perversely incentivize them, but they want to spend their income, because that's how life works. So they have to have an income in gold. How do you get all this to go forward? How do you get this to work? So you have to find, so this is what my company Monetary Metals does, you have to find those companies at the margin that are prepared to borrow gold today, and there are those out there. But in a broader sense, how do you solve it for society? So I proposed a mechanism that I think is pretty clever, and that is you have to replace all the extant irredeemable paper debt. Irredeemable meaning there's no way to extinguish it, you're just constantly rolling it. This is what the US Treasury does. Every time a bond matures, they sell a new bond at a greater amount to pay the principal and the interest off on the old one. So how do you get out of this? So what I propose is the big government debtors of the world sell, instead of, well, they're going to continue doing that anyway for now, but they sell a gold bond, which is just like a regular bond except it's denominated in gold and not in dollars. They have to have a gold income to amortize it, so they tax the gold miners today like everybody else. They should flip that and say, now we want to tax you in gold rather than in dollars for that gold. You have gold mining production that can amortize a certain amount of gold bond. You come to the market and say, I have this gold bond. I'm not selling it for dollars. If I want to raise more dollars, then I'll just sell more paper bonds. I'm not selling it for gold. I have a gold income. I'm not trying to raise gold either. To buy this bond, you have to, Mr. Market, you have to come and say how much of our existing paper bond do you want to tender in exchange for this. So it's a redemption process. And this has to be a market price. There's a lot of people in the gold standard community who say a gold standard is when the Fed is going to fix the right gold price. That's another one of those things that's not even wrong. First of all, there isn't a right gold price. It's constantly changing at every millisecond. It's a new number. Secondly, if there were a right gold price, the central planners of the Fed wouldn't be able to know it. And thirdly, if there were a gold price and they were able to know it, they wouldn't actually have a mechanism to affect it anyways. So it's just one of those things that's just so far off base. This has to be a market process. They can't say, we're going to dictate redemption of all our existing bonds at this amount of gold. That would be the greatest lobbying fest ever, lined up around the gold price. And all the creditors would want, do you think a low gold price or a high gold price? All the creditors would want a low gold price. They would say, let's go back to $20 an ounce, which it was in 1913. So if I'm owed $1,000 at $20 an ounce, you have to pay me 50 bleep ounces of gold. The debtors are going to say, we want a high gold price. Let's take the M3 money supply and divide by the amount of gold that the Fed is holding and have $100,000 an ounce. So if I owe $1,000, I pay you 0.01 ounces and I'm out of debt, scot-free. So all the creditors would line up on one side demanding a lower gold price. All the debtors would line up on the other side. It would be the greatest lobbying orgy that Washington, D.C. had ever seen, lined up around this issue of what is the rate that the Fed is now going to force down everybody in the market's throats by force in fixing this redemption rate. It would never work. It would be such a disaster that it would never work. So there has to be a market mechanism. So the market mechanism is, we have this new bond over here. It's now payable in gold. So I offer the following thought experiment. Suppose you had a choice. You're the saver. You have 100 ounces of gold capital, and let's use an $1,800 gold price just to make the math simple. You could choose, and it's the same borrower is issuing two different instruments that both have the same maturity. It's the same borrower, which means the same credit risk. One instrument promises to pay you $180,000 in 10 years. The other instrument promises to pay you 100 ounces of gold in 10 years. Which one do you pick? Now, the funny thing with that question, framed in that way, is that even the non-gold people immediately know the answer. I'll take the gold, thank you very much. The gold is something tangible, something that everyone can understand has a value. But what is a dollar going to be worth in 10 years? Nobody has the slightest idea, but much likely lower than it is now, and perhaps quite a lot lower. And then if certain forces get out of control, maybe really, really, really a lot lower. The gold, well, the gold price goes up and down, but you're not going to be facing there's no risk of a 98% loss on gold to be paid in 10 years. So if the same debtor, the same obligor, has a choice of two different instruments, and the same credit risk, the same maturity, people will choose the gold one. So this creates an interesting market dynamic. So one would expect if they were going to issue $1.8 million of this new gold bond, and you have to buy out of the market existing paper bonds in order to tender, one would expect at first this would be par, like on a golf course. You hit 3, that's par. Par would be that people would tender $1.8 million worth of paper bond to exchange for the new gold bond. And by the way, this is a redemption. They're returning back to the debtor that paper, which now can be torn up. The debt is extinguished, or replaced with a gold debt, but as the gold debt is paid with gold coin, that gold debt can be extinguished. The paper debt cannot be. You would think that they would offer about a par exchange value, but the market's not stupid. Maybe on the first one it might be par. But I think, and so you would do a very small issue to get started and an experiment, but with each succeeding, every couple of weeks or every couple of months, you issue more gold bond. The market's going to say, we prefer the gold bond to the paper bond. That preference will be expressed as a paper bond to gold bond exchange rate, which will not be 1-to-1, which means the government can get out of debt at a discount. And that's what I think, there's three things about this that I think are what makes it work. One is it's a market process that people are going to freely choose it, and it makes sense to their self-interest. People aren't doing this because, well, one day we're going to have a gold standard and that's going to be a great world that I want my grandkids to grow up in. And so I'm now being expected to do something that's against my immediate short-term self-interest for the greater good. People don't behave that way. But there's a short-term and clear self-interest principle at work here. Number two, it's a market rate, which means the price is being set right. It's not being dictated by the government with all the perverse incentives that occur. And number three, it prevents the collapse of the paper bond market and gives us a graceful segue, a gradual process. And because there's a relentless bid now on the paper, because the paper bond is the ticket to buy the gold bond, which is what you can't buy the gold bond directly. There will be a relentless bid on the paper, which will keep the market stable. It's very, very important, in my opinion, to keep the financial system solvent. There are some out there in the world that really do want to see HSBC and JP Morgan destroyed and collapse and crash and burn. But that's destruction for destruction's sake. And forget what you think of Jamie Dimon and the executives at HSBC or whatever. Think about what happens to all the savers and all the businesses, all the employers that had cash in these banks, and then suddenly the banks go belly up. That would be an unmitigated disaster. And also we have insurers, pension funds, there's an entire financial system out there. We don't want to destroy that. We want to provide a graceful segue. And so this market-based mechanism provides something that isn't going to be like a, destroy the world in a thermonuclear bomb, but at least all the bad guys are dead. No, this is let's find a way to get over here in a way that doesn't destroy that and gives people an incentive to come over here. So interest on gold is that incentive, and that's the gold cure to this cancer. Guess I used up about an hour.
Yeah.
So I'm happy to take questions, comments.
All right, so let's take one super chat and then one question from the live audience. So the first super chat is Christopher. He says, a precious metal standard and a democracy are impossible. Laissez-faire and democracy are impossible. Voters do not want to be educated about this. Any comment?
Well, I think that's just a very, both depressing but I think kind of cynical view. So I'm not really going to address the political, social aspects of that. But what I'm proposing is a free market mechanism. So think of Uber. Uber didn't try to go lobby the taxi commission, whoever controls the black cabs here in London. They just said, well, we're going to make this app and we're going to make cars available. And when they did that and they were successful, the world saw something better. And the voters never would have voted to end the taxi cartel. But the consumers are voting with their money every day to get into an Uber. So it's a free market mechanism rather than lobbying. So speaking for myself personally, I spent many years trying to lobby the state of Arizona, Texas, other states to pass, and also at the federal level, and I've met with legislators around the world to try to lobby for better gold laws. In Arizona, it took 5 years. It was lobbied 3 times by 2 Republican governors. It was vetoed. Eventually passed a very watered down version of it. I do not think that lobbying the legislators and anything monetary is likely to succeed. But I do think that going to the savers and say, here's a better, here's an option for your savings. The savers will vote with their gold in the same way that the passengers voted with their money for Uber. Anybody in the room? Yes, sir.
You mentioned the interest rates about positive, zero, and negative being problematic. But for gold, couldn't you end up with negative interest rates as well if the government wanted to encourage borrowing of gold for entrepreneurs?
Yeah, but the difference is in gold, everybody will just pull their gold back. You'll have a run on the banks, and then that will be the corrective. So the cure for, the expression, the cure for low prices is low prices, and the cure for high prices is high prices. The cure for low interest rates is low interest rates. So the savers just pull back. They say, I'm not going to participate. And every time you pull a gold coin out of a bank, it forces the bank to sell one ounce worth of asset to repay that needs to raise the funds. And so the dumping of all those assets pushes the price of the asset down, which is pushing the interest rate up in order to feed that savers. So you get a contraction. So the savers have the ability to cause or force a credit contraction in gold, which is that's what's been taken away from them in the irredeemable system we have today.
Doesn't that encourages saving, and then it discourages investing with your savings?
Well, if the interest rate is insufficient, what you basically get is hoarding. I mean, there's 2 kinds of savings. There's hoarding when I have the gold physically in my possession, or under my mattress, or maybe in a safety deposit box at the bank. And then there's depositing in the bank, whatever we're doing to use for that, and investing, where the gold can come to market and then finance productive enterprises. But if the interest rate is wrong, or the risk is wrong, so if the government is saying, we want to borrow to finance not a productive enterprise, but to finance welfare, piss it down a welfare drain, then the savers are going to say, no, my money or not. So the thing, getting past the word gold here for a minute, it's just that the saver has the ability to say yay or nay. That is the essential characteristic here. And that arbitrage, and that is an arbitrage between hoarding versus investing, that arbitrage will be decided by the interest rate. If the interest rate is sufficiently high, they'll invest it, and if the interest rate is too low, they'll hoard it. And so that hoardability is a key characteristic to make the monetary system work.
And you don't think that slows down the economy?
Well, it absolutely does slow it down, but that is the corrective to an economy that is, conventional economics says, well, you reach a threshold and then it's overheated. But when you study the individual, what you see is more and more borrowing for unproductive purposes, which means more and more unsound borrowing that can't be repaid. If that is what the government is somehow enabling or encouraging or even forcing, the saver is rightfully saying, I'm not going to give my money to that, because he knows he's going to lose it in the end. If you lend to somebody without means to repay, and so if they're just pissing it down a welfare drain, they don't have the means to repay it. They spend it and it's gone, and they owe you the money, but where are they going to get to repay? You're going to lose 100% of your principal. So it is rightful to, yes, put a brake on this, and then a whole other lecture is to talk about the fatal flaws in GDP. There are a lot of very destructive things that add to GDP that are called growth today. And I just leave it for everybody's consideration. But suppose you think of the accumulated capital of centuries as a giant bin holding all the seed corn. The breaking out of the seed corn and serving it up as a feast is very labor intensive, and there are lots of businesses that make a lot of money. So you get profits and employment and wages and economic activity. That is all additive to GDP when they're simply consuming the seed corn. So if it is a seed corn consumption exercise, yes, you want to contract that. That is a feature, not a bug. That is a good thing.
Let's go to another super chat. So Christopher again says, cryptocurrency is the only way to have a sound currency. We have to have a currency that politicians can't destroy. Cryptocurrency can't be governed.
Well, we had gold for thousands of years, so any statement that says there's only crypto as a sound money is you're bypassing thousands of years of history that says, well, there was another one. Without getting into the debate of gold versus crypto, I mean, in a certain sense, if the direction of society and culture and the prevailing philosophy and the prevailing ideas in our society are headed towards totalitarianism, there isn't any particular monetary system that's going to work. This is called begging the question. What money will prevent the government from becoming North Korea? Well, there isn't one, because what prevents us from becoming North Korea isn't a magic money trick. It's the fact that our society today wouldn't tolerate that degree of totalitarianism. But if the government is going to be trending more and more, and it is trending in that direction right now, unfortunately, more and more towards totalitarianism, there's no monetary technology. So there's a movie called The Lives of Others, and anybody who thinks that Bitcoin, or anything else for that, gold, it doesn't matter, will prevent that kind of totalitarianism should watch that movie. Everyone should watch it too, it's a good movie. But it's written by a guy who grew up in East Germany, and it was about East Germany before the wall came down, so what was life like under communism? It was such a totalitarian, and I think North Korea is worse, but it was so totalitarian. The government knew every typewriter in the country, so obviously if you wanted to write seditious publications, you wouldn't write it in your handwriting because they knew your handwriting. And they had handwriting samples from everybody. You would type it. They knew every typewriter in the country, and every typewriter has little defects and whatever that form that typewriter signature. They had experts that recognized the signature of every typewriter. So if you type something that the government considered to be, a wrong thing, they could come straight to your house and they knew it was you because it was your typewriter. So if we have a government that is that hell-bent on becoming East Germany, let alone North Korea, then they'll be watching what you do on your computer anyway. And they can do, and the IRS was talking about this 20 years ago, they're called lifestyle audits. Well, we can't necessarily see what income you got from where. However, you seem to spend too richly for the wages you make at your job. So we know you're cheating. So they can get you that way. And then the third one is, there was a guy by the name of Ross Ulbricht who went by the handle Dread Pirate Roberts. And at least with Bitcoin, now there's other cryptos that work differently. All they have to do is figure out how to tie your Bitcoin wallet ID to your person. One person has to figure it out once, and then all of your transactions are suddenly laid bare, and they're all on the blockchain indelibly. So I don't think it's correct to say that there's a technology that will prevent kind of a totalitarian state. And if we're going in that direction, we've got a bigger problem, and the biggest problem in the world isn't the money. The biggest problem is that your fellow citizens are ready to rat on you. So when the Berlin Wall fell, eventually they declassified the Stasi, which was their secret police, had a file on everybody. And a lot of people got arrested and tortured, all kinds of bad things happened. So this guy went through hell, and they destroyed his life, and they tortured him and all these things. And when they finally declassified it, and he went in to see his file, guess who was the one who ratted him to the government? His brother. Like, if we're anywhere near that level, guys, Bitcoin ain't gonna save you from that. When your brother is gonna turn you into the government for an extra set of rations, or maybe just revenge for in the 4th grade when you got the gold star for your singing and he was asked to stop singing because he's tone deaf or whatever. If we're at that level, then we got a whole nother and much larger problem.
I agree. Yeah, do you think it's actually kind of got to the point where it's almost like Big Brother watching us and everything? If it carries on like this, we might have had a World War III if it doesn't take down a bit.
There's a lot of Big Brother. I took the tube to get over here, and there was an announcement as I'm riding down the escalator. Transport for London uses closed caption video throughout the underground system. Thank you. And I'm just like, that's the voice of Big Brother. That's what it is. And people have to push back on that. They have to push back on the idea of lockdowns. There's so many things they have to push back on. But I think they are. I think people are getting pretty sick of lockdowns. I see, quite high non-compliance rates for even wearing masks on the tube. So, there's a limit that people will be willing to tolerate, and when the government goes past that limit, then there's pushback.
I hope you're right. I'm not sure I'm as optimistic. Jean asks, Keith, what's in your investment portfolio? Thanks for this enlightening talk.
Well, you're welcome. I'm not sure that it would be appropriate for me to talk about my personal investments. That said, as an entrepreneur, it's not atypical for entrepreneurs to end up with a majority of their net worth tied up in their business. At this stage, I'm building a company called Monetary Metals. We're investor-backed. I'm one of the investors. I've got a great deal of my capital in the business, and that wouldn't necessarily be financial advice for anybody listening to this to go plug down all your money into early stage companies. I think you had a question.
Yes. So you mentioned the metaphor of cancer, and today we have 2 brutal methods to deal with cancer in real life, which are chemo or sometimes cutting some limbs. And today I think in terms of monetary policy, usually there are 2 methods associated to treating this cancer of inflation, which is either raising prices, like raising interest rates like crazy, or cutting off some sort of businesses like Evergrande is going on right now. What do you think about these methods? Do you think they're as brutal as chemotherapy is?
Yeah, I think the analogy kind of falls apart when looking at how medicine today that we call modern tries to deal with cancer, and it isn't. For most cancers, medicine isn't really, even when there's sort of a remission. Often they say there's not a cure, there's remission. Medicine has a lot more to learn about it. But the second part of your question is interesting to me, that I don't think the problem is inflation, and therefore I don't think, well, first of all, it's another one of those things that isn't really even wrong. The problem isn't inflation. That's not the cancer. And raising interest rates would actually cause prices to increase. So most people suppose that the price level is proportional to the quantity of money. One of the early monetarists, by a guy by the name of Newt Wixell in the 1890s, assumed that, and then he went to collect data to prove that it was right. But he was honest enough to realize the data he found proved it wrong, and there was not a correlation between quantity and price level. The correlation was interest rate and price level. This later came to be known as Gibson's paradox. So if you want to raise interest rates, we had rising interest rates from about 1947 to 1981, and the more the interest rates rose, the more prices were skyrocketing. And the reason is very simple. So it's the opposite of what I said earlier. As the interest rate falls, the next marginal entrepreneur borrows and jumps into the production game. As the interest rate rises, every time a company needs to refresh its capital plant, its business case turns red. And they'd rather close down. So it's a process of gutting industry, destroying all the suppliers, and which is exactly what happened certainly during the 1970s. So you can't actually fix rising prices by doing that anyway. I'll add one other thing, a whole other topic that I've written a lot about. I coined the term useless ingredients. So think about baking bread. What are the useful ingredients of baking bread? Well, obviously flour, water, yeast, heat, labor, maybe butter and some kinds of breads, olive oil and some kinds of breads. I don't know what else you add, maybe egg in some breads. That's it. The regulators come along and they say, well, you have to have Americans with Disabilities Act compliant bathrooms for employees, and you have to add preservatives, and you have to track your supply chain, and you have to have a nutrition label of how many calories the bread has and so on. And each of these things is adding cost, but it's adding cost in a way where it's providing something that your customer doesn't value and often doesn't even know is even in the product. So the price of the product is going up. Oh, and then the taxinators, that's the regulators. The taxinators come along and says, we're going to have a 5 cent per loaf tax, and we're going to have a usage fee, and then we're going to tax ovens based on their carbon footprint and so on. So you have taxinators and regulators adding cost to the loaf of bread, but the consumers aren't even aware of any of this. So the consumers say, look, it's inflation, and they go back to their axiom, which is inflation. Milton Friedman, inflation, everybody repeat after me, class, in unison. Inflation is everywhere and always a monetary phenomenon. So everyone says, well, this must be money printing and so on, raise the interest rate as a curative, but it wasn't a monetary phenomenon. It was every time the regulators come along, they force the bakers to add more and more and more useless ingredients to the bread. The price is going up and up and up and up. The curative is to repeal those regulations, not to raise the interest rate.
So Duncan asks, would it make sense to start investing in gold only after a gold-based system has been established, or does it make sense to own gold now?
So a whole other thing that I get into is the proper use of concepts. And I make a distinction between speculating and investing. So when investing returns have been wiped out by central bank policy, as yields go to zero, investing returns go to zero as well. People seek speculative returns as a proxy. So if you can't get interest in the bank, you buy some asset. The asset's going up in price, and that's a proxy, and you sell the asset at a higher price later, so you had a return. That's a proxy for investing. But I think economically, they're exact opposite phenomenon that have opposite economic consequences. In investing, you are financing production, either more of a good that is in demand by consumers, or a new kind of good that wasn't even previously existing. And the profit to the investor comes from part of the profit of the production of whatever it is that you just financed. In speculation, nothing is being financed. The profit comes by selling the asset to the next speculator. So the profit comes from the next speculator's capital. It is a process of conversion. And as I say that word, I'm very well aware that in archaic English and in legal circles, the word conversion has an overtone of like an illicit taking, not necessarily illegal, but illicit. As a process of conversion of one person's capital into another person's income. Now, nobody wants to be the prodigal son, if you recall the biblical story. Nobody wants to squander their life savings and their inheritance. However, if someone else's life savings comes over to you in the form of an investment profit, so-called, which is a speculative profit, why not spend that? So that's part of Keynes' destruction and overthrow of civilization, as getting everybody to fork over increasingly large amounts of their capital to a perfect stranger in exchange for some asset, purely because they expect, and maybe rationally so I don't use the word speculation to mean gamble or risk. It may be very rational to think that the next speculator will fork over even more of his capital to you than you forked over to the previous guy who just sold out. That might be correct. But the profit that's coming to you is the next guy's life savings, and you spend some of it. And so I think investing and speculating are opposite economically. Is there more on the super chat?
No, that was the last super chat.
All right.
I have a question, but I kind of lost it as you as you mentioned the last half. But it was to do with, you mentioned lobbying politicians previously. But since we live in this debt-based society and the banks very much encourage borrowing, making returns on interest and such, and because we live in a political economy where both the corporations and the politicians are interlinked, how do you see lobbying those very politicians to solve the issue and encouraging a gold-backed standard?
I don't, and that was my point for having spent 5+ years trying to lobby. I don't think lobbying will be successful, and if there is a transition path here, it will be just like Uber, a free market, path that some entrepreneur, I happen to think it's myself, but whether it's myself or not, economically it doesn't matter. It matters to me a lot, but not to the rest of you. Offering people a choice of something that's better personally in the here and now, and which, so I think a lot about that Keynes quote, leveraging all the hidden forces of economics in favor of destruction. And that was kind of the gestation process of thinking about monetary metals. And I thought, what if you could leverage all the hidden forces of economics, not in favor of destruction, but in favor of helping the world transition to something better? And I think that if this is going to happen at all, it's going to be that. It's going to be people choosing something better because they're earning interest on their gold rather than failing to earn interest on their paper. And so everybody's going to vote with their wallet. So the question was investing in gold. So getting back to that, gold is the thing, gold is money. Gold is the thing you own when you don't want to invest. When you sell all your investments and you cash out and say, I'm going to take my marbles home and not play anymore in the sandbox. Right? So it used to be the kids, I don't know if this is still true, would gamble. Basically, it's a gambling game with the marbles. So you have your marbles, and then you'd shoot the marbles, and I don't even remember the rules of it anymore. But if you won, you got other people's marbles, and if you lost, they got yours, and that was for keeps. So if you didn't want to lose anymore, you thought, okay, these kids are either cheating or they're better than me. You literally take your marbles out of the sandbox, put them in your jacket, and leave. Gold is the thing that you own when you don't want to invest in anything else, because either the returns are too low, or the risks are too high, or there's something unsound about it. And so I would say to people, buy as much gold as you think that what I just said applies, or don't buy any gold if you think you're getting great returns, and you trust the folks that you're investing with. Then that's kind of how you draw that line. Or open an account at Monetary Metals and earn a return on your gold at 2 or 3%, and then it does become an investment and not purely speculation anymore. And it's about how much gold you're earning rather than the dollar price of your gold stash.
So we just got another super chat again from G, who says monetary metals looks super interesting. Offering gold to businesses who use gold productively. Would you return to talk more about this business?
Sure, happy to do that. So I said earlier that you have to appeal to self-interest. So by saying to people, we'll pay you interest on your gold, that's pretty attractive. And when people that are thinking about this issue at all, you hear that and they say, well, I want to open an account. But the other side of it is how do we pay the interest? Well, you have to put the gold to work doing something productive. This is not some sort of self-reflective, aim through mirrors at each other and try to get a perpetual motion return out of it. There are real businesses that are doing something with gold, whether they're manufacturing jewelry or high-tech sputtering. If you've ever seen mirrored sunglasses, that's done with a sputtering process, that all use gold in some way, and that gold has to be financed. So we're placing the gold with these businesses, and those businesses, of course, expect to pay for the finance, and it also eliminates their risk. If you borrow $1 million to finance $1 million worth of gold for your inventory, and the gold price drops 10%, you're bankrupt. Because you still owe the $1 million, but now you only have $900,000 worth of gold at the new market price. So you have to hedge that, and the hedging adds cost and complexity, risk, and moving parts. Or if you lease it, then all that goes away and becomes simpler, more user-friendly finance to the businesses. So monetary metal is essentially pulling the parties together and creating, you know, liquidity around this. I'm not sure that I want to, it'd be appropriate to do too much commercial pitch, something like this, but
To do a pitch. But yeah, and we do hope you will be back to talk about it more on our YouTube channel. There's a last minute super chat by Robert who says, always a good discussion. So Keith, I want to thank you for the talk, and
Can I mention one more thing before we end?
we're going to go off YouTube, but